So hello and welcome to this episode of SelfKind with me, Erica Webb. Today I thought we could talk about intuition and what it's like to be intuitive as a highly sensitive person, because that's something that can come kind of part and parcel with the HSP experience. But it can be really hard, I think, sometimes for highly sensitive people to trust and believe their intuition because they're often really busy up in their heads. So we're going to talk about that today. So intuition is our topic of the day, and I want to just read out to you a couple of things before we dive into the rest of the episode. The first is Google's definition, or I guess the dictionary's definition accessed via Google, definition of intuition. And that is the ability to understand something instinctively without the need for conscious reasoning. I think we all know what this is. Whether we trust it or not is a different thing. I grabbed out my copy of The Highly Sensitive Person, which is Elaine Aron's book, one of her books about highly sensitive people. And I went back to the index and had a little look. What did she have to say about intuition? And I found a really awesome passage that I want to read to you, because I think sometimes highly sensitive people can easily dismiss their connection with their intuition, because our heads can be really noisy places. There is so much being processed and thought through and dots being connected that accessing your intuition, which I believe probably lives more in our body than our mind, can feel a little bit tricky. So I want to read this to you from Elaine. She says, "This greater awareness of the subtle tends to make you more intuitive, which simply means picking up and working through information in a semi-conscious or unconscious way. The result is that you often just know without realizing how. Furthermore, this deeper processing of subtle details causes you to consider the past or future more. You just know how things got to be the way they are, or how they are going to turn out. This is the sixth sense people talk about. It can be wrong, of course, just as your eyes and ears can be wrong. But your intuition is right often enough that HSPs tend to be visionaries, highly intuitive artists or inventors, as well as more conscientious, cautious, and wise people." I really like that passage. I think it's really beautiful. One of the things that she talks about there is this greater awareness of the subtle. And that's the thing, I guess, that kind of can feed this intuition so much in highly sensitive people, is that we're paying attention to the subtle at a level that other people aren't. And so deep connections can be made behind the scenes, completely outside of our conscious awareness. And because we're accessing so much information and processing so much information on a very deep level, those connections can be kind of sorted out in the background. And then, there is this sense of like, I don't know how I know that, but I just know. But what I mentioned before, and what bears repeating, is that as an HSP, myself, and one that works with other HSPs, what I know is that accessing that intuition and believing it, trusting it, can be tricky, especially when we feel like we're stuck in our heads, stuck in the thinking, stuck in the overthinking, stuck trying to figure out what everybody else wants, stuck trying to figure out what might be, quote unquote, right or wrong. And so this conflict, the sense of maybe knowing but doubting, causes its own kind of overstimulation, right? It causes its own kind of overwhelm, because there's this conflict, this push and pull, this sense that we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because there isn't a clear direction to go in. So I think it really pays off to get more skilled at accessing and trusting our intuition. So what I want to do today is offer you up a really simple way to access this. Now, it's simple. That doesn't always mean it's going to be easy. And I do think that it requires us to be open-minded and curious, and for it to be something that we come back to time and time again. Because like everything, practice gives us more information to work with. So here's how this works. What I want you to do, and if you're driving, just pocket this information for later and you can do it after. But if you're in a place where you can kind of let your mind drift and you can bring something into your mind and play with it a little bit, then what I want you to pull to mind is a time when you had either a really clear yes or a really clear no that you just knew. right? You just had that feeling. You're like, I know this is a yes, or I know this is a no. It could be, you sat down at a restaurant and you were like, I just know I want the pasta, right? It could be that you had an invitation to something and it was such an easy hell yes that there was just like no doubt, right? Or it could be a really clear, loud no when you tried on a dress that you were like, this is just not me. Or you were picking a decorative item for your home and it was like just a very clear no. It can be anything, right? It could be a big thing. It can be a small thing. I've had a few of these big yeses when it really didn't make logical sense to have a big yes, but I was very aware of the feeling in my body. One of them was when I went to LA a couple of years ago on my own. When I had that opportunity, it was such a clear yes that I could just not ignore it. But then I've also had those clear yeses, literally picking an item off of a menu at the restaurant, right? And on the flip side of that, both of those experiences have also, there have been other versions of that where it's been impossible. Like, I have no idea what I want to eat off the menu. I have no idea if I can say yes to that invitation. So we're looking for a specific instance where it's been a really clear yes or a really clear no. And I want you to, as you kind of hold this memory in your mind, pay attention to how your body feels. Pay attention to what your body does. Of particular note, you're looking for where that sense of surety came from. Where was that sense of knowing? Was it a spaciousness in your gut? Was it a calmness in your chest, the absence of something? Was it a quickening of your heart, a feeling of excitement? Was it a steadiness in your head? What is it that you notice? It's going to be unique to you. There's some of the things that, might be possible, but it could be something completely different. What is it that you notice that you go, oh yeah, that's the feeling that I have when it's a really clear yes or a really clear no? Now, if you are like, I don't know, I don't feel anything, that's okay, right? We're just opening the possibility that there might be something there to notice, and it's giving you, I guess, a sense of what you could pay attention to next time, and just time after time after time being curious. How do I know this is a yes? How do I know this is a no? Where am I getting that information from? Where is that sense of surety if I have it? And this is the thing that we want to pay attention to in those times when the mind might be taking over with a series of doubts, questions, objections, desires to people please, crowdsourcing opinions, all of that jazz. And the reality is that as a highly sensitive person, there's a very good chance you're going to do all of that anyway, right? You're going to crowdsource, you're going to research, you're going to find all the information that you can to make a decision. Often, not always, but often. And that's fine, right? This isn't, accessing your intuition isn't about not accessing other information. It's not about ignoring your mind. But at some point, you do have to access, what do I know to be true? And rarely does that exist only in logic, right? So where do you go to figure that out? And I truly believe that the place that you go to figure that out is your body. Noticing what your body tells you, noticing the signals that are there. And one of the things that I've heard quite often from others when I've sort of walked them through things like this is that it's actually often just the absence of something, right? That feeling of certainty or surety is often the absence of the doubt, the anxiety, etc. And so sometimes we're looking for not so much a feeling, but an absence of feeling, which I guess is a feeling in and of itself, which is a kind of a wild thought to try to wrap your head around. But we want to pay attention to it, right? And we want to sense, what do I feel? Where do I feel it? Get familiar with it. Get curious about it. Get really interested in it. And when your mind gets too noisy to listen to your body, I have a couple of tips. Because that's going to happen, right? It's one thing to be able to access sort of that body intuition and that sense of, yep, this feels right. But it's just a reality that your brain is probably also going to be, but what about this and what about that? And have you considered, and they might not like, and all of those things that can pop up. And so when that happens, my invitation to you is to have a really loving, gentle conversation with yourself that basically says, hey, mind, I just want to hit pause on all of that worry and that rumination and that questioning for a minute. Just 1 minute so that I can access my body's wisdom. And I will come back if that's needed, right? I will come back. The rumination can continue if I decide that that's what I need, but I just need to hit pause for 1 second so I can access my body. And then once I've accessed my body, I can come back and we can see if we can marry these things up, right? And I guess one thing I want to add to this is a little practice that I find really helpful when the mind feels a bit too noisy to access that body wisdom, is when you're stuck in indecision, have that little thought process of like, okay, I'm just going to hit pause on the rumination and I'm going to play I'm going to do an experiment, right? I'm going to play a little game here where I give myself the time and space to fully imagine stepping into one direction or the other. And you do both, right? So you sort of say, okay, well, I'm going to fully step into option A, imagine that I've said yes, or imagine that I've said no, or imagine that I've gone here or there or whatever. And then I'm going to do the opposite option. And I'm going to check in with my body as I do that. How does my body feed me back information about the fit of that choice when I check in with it? And the key here is to try to step into the gap between your body's response and your mind's reply. Because that's where the gold, I think, is. We can always go back to our mind and see what it's got to say, right? It often has some valuable information, and that's great. But sometimes that noise and that loudness and that cacophony that can be present in our mind doesn't help us to get to the truth of what we want or what we sort of feel most connected to. It's kind of like extra information that's great to help us make a final decision. And so we want to kind of slip into that gap, right? My body's had a response or a reaction, and my mind is like, maybe got some thoughts about that, but like, what did my body say first? I want to grab onto that information. I'd love to know if that's helpful. I sort of sat down as I was thinking about doing this episode, and I thought, I think of myself as quite an intuitive person, but I also think of myself as quite an anxious person. And I have been quite an anxious person over my life, much less in recent years, but it's been a fixture in earlier years for sure. And I was trying to think like how I work with those two things side by side, because they can fight with each other a little bit at times, right? And so I've really tried to come at this from the perspective of how I work with it in real time. And I hope it's helpful. I really hope that helps you to access something that perhaps makes this idea of intuition feel a little bit more concrete. And I think the one more thing that I want to say about that before we finish up is that this idea of intuition can feel very woo-woo, right? And I'm I like a bit of woo-woo. I'm not anti-woo-woo, but I am very pro-science and I am very pro things that are grounded in truth. And so I guess the really cool thing to think about when you think about intuition as a highly sensitive person is that it's kind of clear where that intuition comes from. It comes from a depth of processing that's going on behind the scenes that you don't have conscious access to, right? Or you haven't been consciously attending to. And so it makes sense. If your supercomputer brain is taking all this information and sorting it out and making connections and sifting through it and working through it, and then you just, I had a knowing. That makes sense, right? It's like when you set something up on your computer to do all the processing and you come back later and it's like, this process is complete. And you're like, cool, didn't even have to watch, right? So it's very, very similar in a lot of ways. And it takes this kind of woo-woo notion of intuition and it grounds it in something that's very tangible and very real, right? We can just go, yeah, this is my brain, my supercomputer brain processing information and giving me an outcome. What a beautiful, beautiful thing. All right. I wanted to just do a quick announcement before we wrap this episode up because I haven't talked very much about the SelfKind Hub lately because I actually closed the doors to new members for a little while there while I was doing some really big updates. And in the process of doing those updates, I just stopped talking about it because it wasn't available to join. But it's open again now, and we are in a new space that has a lot more features that I'm really loving. And for the very first time, I'm actually offering a 2-week free trial for new members. And I've never done that before because I just haven't. I've never offered a free trial, certainly not 2 weeks. But at the moment and for a short time, I am offering that because I think, what a beautiful way to just be able to come in, absolutely no pressure, see what you think, see if it feels like a good fit for you, and try some stuff out. So I wanted to let you know what's in there so that if you're like, oh, I wouldn't mind 2 free weeks of something, you know what it is that you'd be signing up to. So the SelfKind Hub is my online space for mindful movement, somatic practices, and community connection for highly sensitive people. It really is about managing and embracing and befriending some of the difficult stuff that can come with being a highly sensitive person, primarily the physical kind of tension and feeling wound up that can often come with the overwhelm of being highly sensitive. So we have a bunch of my mindful movement classes in there that really center around somatic exercise and gentle yoga. We do monthly masterclasses together where we deep dive into topics that are relevant to HSPs. And we also have one of the things that is new in the platform that I absolutely love is we have a private podcast feed. And so this podcast isn't going anywhere, the one that you're listening to, but there's also a private podcast feed inside the membership. And we have a series that's just started in there actually just this month that is all about de-armoring or unmasking as a HSP and how we can do that and why we would want to. And I think it's an amazing series, and that is exclusive to members. So that's a brand new feature. We've also got new features being able to favorite classes, so you can make your own little favorites playlists. There's playlists in there that I've created as well. So if you want, a bunch of classes that are going to help you sleep or a bunch of classes that are going to help you wake up in the morning, all that sort of stuff, there are playlists in there. So heaps to explore. If you are curious about taking me up on that 2-week free trial, I will pop the link in the show notes, but you can just head to ericawebb.com.au/SelfKind Hub, and it is all very self-explanatory. All right, I am so grateful you joined me for this episode. I hope it was helpful. I look forward to hearing about your intuitive hits if you feel like sharing, and I will be back next week for more.